On the evening of Monday, September 13th, 2010, Greg Flanagan of Lafayette, Louisiana checked into room 348 at the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. The 55-year-old was the vice president of OGM Land Company and routinely stayed at the Elegante Hotel during the week for work and then checked out on Fridays to drive home on the weekends, where he and his wife Susie owned a quaint bed and breakfast. Everyone who knew Greg described him as outgoing, personable, and extremely generous. He was always willing to help anyone who needed it and was just someone you could depend on. Greg was slim-built and in good shape despite the fact that he loved his cigarettes. He had spent most of his younger years as the chief engineer of vessels out at sea, but had decided as he got older to switch to doing business on land and started a business with his brother. Fleniken was a creature of habit, and that didn't change when he was staying away from home. He always packed light using the same small rolling suitcase, which he basically lived out of for the rest of the week. He had developed a nightly ritual during his weeknights at the hotel. Greg had become used to his quiet weeks at the Elegante and rarely left the room. He enjoyed the relaxing solitude every night while he blasted the air conditioning in his room, propped himself up on the hotel bed while smoking cigarettes, eating candy bars, and watching TV. On the night of Wednesday, September 15th, he had just exchanged some emails with his wife about filing an extension on their tax returns and then decided to get comfortable for the night. He changed out of his work clothes, cranked up the AC, and was picking apart a candy bar and sipping on a root beer while watching Iron Man 2 in bed. Greg would call his wife Susie first thing every single morning without exception. When Susie didn't get a call the morning of Thursday, September 16th, she immediately felt like something was wrong. After making multiple attempts to call him, she started to get alarmed and contacted his coworkers. She pleaded with them to swing by the Elegante Hotel and check up on him. When the two coworkers arrived at the Elegante, they summoned the manager and explained the situation. The manager accompanied them up to the third floor and down the hall to room 348, where Greg was staying. As the manager pushed the door open, they all stared in stunned silence. Susie's instincts were tragically right on target. 55-year-old Greg Flanagan laid dead on the floor, face down. He still had a cigarette clenched between two fingers on his left hand. One of the first things they noticed was that the room felt exceptionally hot and humid. The manager ushered everyone back out of the room and called the police and EMS. When Detective Scott Apple arrived on the scene, he looked around the hotel room for any signs that something nefarious had taken place, but didn't see any signs of a struggle. In addition to that, Greg had $1,000 cash in his wallet, which he felt ruled out any kind of botched robbery. Greg had no apparent wounds aside from a small abrasion on his left cheek from his fall. Investigators concluded that Greg must have died of natural causes. Since he was a very heavy smoker, they assumed he must have had a heart attack, got up to try to get help, but didn't make it and fell to the ground. Susie was heartbroken. She and Greg had a romantic, if not unique, love story. They had gotten married very young, and sadly, the marriage didn't last. However, 20 years later, Susie found herself missing Greg and decided to reach out to him. When he answered the phone and heard her voice, he simply said, "I've been waiting for you to call." They had gotten married a second time in their 40s and had been married for almost 15 years. She tried to comfort herself with the fact that Greg had appeared to die a very sudden death with no suffering. Dr. Thomas Brown was a very well-respected medical examiner in Jefferson County, Texas. When he received Greg's body, he was prepared to do a quick but efficient, routine post-mortem exam from what was believed to be a possible heart attack. However, after he had Greg's body prepared, something caught his attention. Dr. Brown noticed that Greg had a small circular wound on his scrotum that caused quite a bit of swelling and bruising that extended all the way over to his right hip. Dr. Brown wondered to himself if Greg had been kicked by something pointed, like a steel-toed boot. As he began his internal examination, he then knew something definitely wasn't right. Greg had multiple fractured ribs and had lacerations to his internal organs. There was noticeable traumatic damage to his liver, stomach, and intestines, and a rupture in his heart. This made no sense to Dr. Brown. The outside of Greg's body looked fine with the exception of the 2 small wounds to his face and scrotum, but the inside of his body looked like he'd been crushed with a heavy object or beaten to death. The damage to Greg's organs would have caused massive internal bleeding, and he would have been dead in under a minute. Dr. Brown ruled Greg Flanagan's death as a homicide and called Detective Apple to let him know. It took Detective Apple a moment to process what Dr. Brown was telling him. He did not expect this news. Detective Apple now had a murder to investigate. He had to consider everyone in Greg's life as a potential suspect and go back to the beginning and try to retrace Greg's steps that night at the Elegante Hotel. The detective began by working from the inside out. He had to consider that Susie or Greg's brother Mike could possibly have a motive to want Greg gone. He also questioned Greg's coworkers, friends, and neighbors. He couldn't find anyone with anything bad to say. Greg Flanagan had no enemies. The detective also began questioning the employees around the hotel and learned that on the night of September 15th, Greg decided to make some popcorn, and with the AC already at maximum, running the microwave caused a fuse to blow. This in turn caused his room 349 next door, and the room below him to lose power. Greg ended up having to call maintenance up to his room to fix the issue. The detective ran a background check and discovered that the maintenance man had a felony record, but there was no evidence to suggest that he had done anything to Greg. Investigators wondered if Greg causing the fuse to blow would have angered the men next door, causing a fight to ensue in the hallway. That could possibly explain why there would be no signs of a struggle in the room. However, this theory still didn't make any sense, as Greg didn't have any injuries consistent with the beating on the outside of his body. With no other leads, investigators showed up to room 349 to ask the electricians if they witnessed anything strange that night. The 2 men that were registered in that room were Lance Mueller and Tim Steinmetz. Both were electricians from Wisconsin. Detective Apple wore a hidden camera while questioning the pair in their room. The 2 men were very cooperative and seemed genuinely concerned and curious about what had happened next door. They told the investigators that they had never come into contact with Greg and that the only information they had to offer was that they had heard him coughing at some point in the night. Mueller asked the detective what had happened to Greg, and he answered honestly that he didn't know, but that his injuries indicated that he had been crushed. Mueller looked at the detective with a confused expression and remarked that there was nothing heavy enough in these rooms to crush anyone. Investigators then questioned the other electricians that had been hanging out in room 349 that night, but none of them had witnessed anything either. Not finding anything suspicious with the electricians, the police were at a dead end. Frustrated with the lack of answers, Greg's wife Susie hired private investigator Ken Brennan in February of 2011. Brennan was an ex-Long Island cop and DEA agent who had retired, moved down to Florida, and was now a successful private investigator. Brennan looked every bit the part of a retired New York cop, had a thick East Coast accent, and a no BS attitude. He also had a reputation for solving the unsolvable. He flew down to Louisiana and sat down with Susie, asking her to go through all of the facts that she knew so far, and then asked her to recall anything that seemed strange or out of the ordinary. Susie thought about it for a minute and then replied that she did think it was really strange that the hotel room was noticeably warm when Greg always kept his room ice cold at night so that he could sleep better. Brennan then drove the 2 hours to Beaumont to meet with Detective Apple, and the two spent all day reviewing all of the evidence from the crime scene, all of the photos, the autopsy report, and the limited interviews that investigators had done. After spending hours and hours going through all of the information, Brennan suddenly turned to Detective Apple and said, "I think I know how this guy died. I think I know when he died. I think I know who killed him. And I think I know how we're going to catch him." The detective looked back at him skeptically, but Brennan asked him to just hear him out. When reviewing the crime scene photos, Brennan had noticed that Fleniken was still holding a cigarette in his left hand at the time of his death. Before explaining his theory to the detective, he quickly called Susie, asking her about Greg's smoking habits. Susie confirmed that Greg was right-handed and never smoked with his left hand. That cinched it for Brennan. Brennan asked the detective if they could go to the hotel so he could show him his theory in person, and the two headed off to the Elegante. When they arrived, the two headed up to the third floor and entered room 348. Brennan theorized that the blown fuse actually gave away when the mysterious incident had likely occurred. They knew from the maintenance records that the fuse had blown at 8:30 p.m. His thought process was that Greg probably assumed that when his TV came back on, that the AC had also kicked back on, but it didn't. You had to get up and manually turn it back on, unlike the TV. He estimated that with how hot it was that night, that Greg probably would have realized that it wasn't working within a few minutes, probably under 30. Brennan also had a theory on why Greg's cigarette was in the wrong hand. He hypothesized that whatever happened to him caused him to jolt up from the bed and switch his cigarette to his left hand, as he planned to use his right hand to try and open the door and get help. However, Greg didn't make it that far and had fallen on the floor, where he laid until he died. The detective agreed that his theories were possible, but they were still missing the biggest piece of the puzzle. What traumatic event caused Greg to spring out of bed in the first place? Since he still had a cigarette clenched between his fingers, that ruled out the possibility that he was beaten to death. With that question still hanging in the air, the detective watched as Brennan began searching all over the walls and ceiling. He noticed a small circular mark in the drywall on the wall where the TV was, adjacent to the door. At first, the detective thought that the mark was from where the door would open and hit the wall, but as they fully opened the door, it didn't line up with the damage. The investigators then went to the other side of the wall with the damage, which happened to be room 349. As Brennan searched along the wall, he found exactly what he was looking for: a small hole that had been filled with toothpaste and toilet paper. The investigators knew they needed to go back to the group of electricians to get some answers. And of course, Brennan had an idea for that too. They decided it was time to turn up the heat to get some honest answers. It was now late May, almost 9 months from when Greg had died. The electricians had left and gone home. The two electricians that were staying in room 349, Tim Steinmetz and Lance Mueller, had gone back home to Wisconsin. Apple and Brennan called Tim Steinmetz first and told them they were flying up to Wisconsin to ask him some more questions. When the three of them met up, they told him they needed an official statement and walked him through everything he could remember that night. When he was done, they had him look over the statement to see if any changes needed to be made. Steinmetz said that there wasn't, and then signed it. When he got up to leave, Brennan stopped him. "Now you've got a problem," Brennan said. Tim seemed confused, so Brennan continued on. "You just made a false report. Now tell us what really happened, or you're going to jail with Lance. It's not worth it. Just tell us what happened." Tim sank back into his chair and told the detectives that on September 15th, 2010, that after they had finished work, they went back to room 349, drank some beers, and became pretty heavily intoxicated. Lance Mueller asked another electrician, Pisano, to fetch a bottle of whiskey from his car and to also bring up his pistol, a 9mm Ruger. When Pisano returned from the parking lot, Mueller took out the handgun and, to the other's alarm, started swinging it around and playing with it. He pointed it directly at Steinmetz, who dropped to the floor and started swearing at him. He then turned and pointed it in Pisano's direction at the foot of the bed when it went off. Pisano had actually thought for a second that he had been shot, but then he turned around to see a hole in the wall behind him. Mueller looked stunned and immediately wrapped up the gun and took it back down to his car. When Mueller got back to the room, Pisano had left angry. He was extremely upset about Mueller almost shooting him and had gone to his room for the rest of the night. Tim and Lance went down to the hotel bar to have some more drinks. Steinmetz said they had not known for sure if anyone was staying in room 348 until the next day, when they remembered that they had heard someone coughing in the room very late after midnight when they came back from the bar. The investigators both felt that the coughing part could be chalked up to both men being drunk and getting their nights confused. They thought it was more likely that they had heard him cough the night before. Tim admitted that the two were very nervous that it could possibly have struck someone, but they never went to check to see if Greg was okay. Instead, they chose to continue their night down in the hotel bar. The next day, when they saw the police and emergency personnel, they were admittedly very anxious, but then heard that Greg had died of natural causes. Police asked Tim to call Lance Mueller while they recorded it. Tim and Lance had gotten together earlier that day to make sure they had their story straight, and Lance was anxiously awaiting to hear how Tim's interview had gone. Lance went silent when Tim told him that the cops had told him that they knew what happened and that he needed to come clean. Lance asked him if he told them about the gun, and Tim confirmed that he did. Then, Steinmetz broke the news. He dropped the bombshell that the guy next door to them had died from the gunshot. Lance seemed stunned and incredulous about what he was hearing. He responded that there's no way that could be true, that they had first heard that it was natural causes, and then the police had been asking about him being crushed by something. He seemed in denial that the stray bullet was what could have killed Greg Flanagan. Later that night, Lance Mueller called investigator Brennan and was obviously extremely intoxicated. He told Brennan that he wanted to have an opportunity to give his side of the story. Brennan cut him off, told him that he was drunk, and that his better option was to call his attorney. Lance Mueller was sentenced in October 2012 to 10 years on a manslaughter charge for the death of Greg Flanagan. The severity of his sentence for the accidental shooting was attributed to his egregious actions afterwards. Had he just come forward to the police and explained what happened from the beginning, it was likely he would have never been charged or spent a day in jail. During sentencing, Susie Fleniken got a chance to speak to Mueller. "You would have never come forward with the truth. You murdered him. No, you didn't intentionally seek him out to murder him, but you murdered him. With every lie you told, with every intentional selfish deception, with every cover-up, over and over again. You saw his body taken out of the room in a body bag the next day. You knew you killed him. He meant nothing to you." Susie Fleniken filed a wrongful death suit against the MCM Elegante, Delta Security, and the 3 electricians, Lance Mueller, Trent Pisano, and Timothy Steinmetz. However, she dismissed the suit in 2015 after reaching a settlement with Pisano. In the years after Greg's death, Susie has learned to forgive Lance Mueller. She's used yoga, therapy, and music to work through her pain. In a more recent interview, Susie stated, "You better have faith or something good that you're pulling into, because the opposite is waiting for you. The monkey on your back, to bring you down, because it is so painful."